very happy to be here amongst my peers. It gives me great pleasure to have this opportunity to share with you some information, and I'm especially honored to be here on the traditional territories of the Algonquin people, and to hear the beautiful prayer that was offered this morning. I think it grounded all of us to remind us of where we come from and how lucky we are today. Listen to the words about, for example, the fact that we can hear the drum, and the children in the residential school could never hear the drum. So I think that those kinds of things show us that there's been progress made. And I'm here to talk a lot about the businesses where we've made a lot of progress across the country. In my work, every day, for the past 30 years, I've been with the Wabatek Business Development Corporation as the general manager. I never thought that I would be with an organization for that long, and without any banking experience, having a pretty good success rate with our organization. And I want to acknowledge my colleague here, Jason Pelchet. He works alongside me, and he works directly with the businesses too. And I think we have, as AFIs, some of the best jobs in the world, because it's an area where we can help grow Indigenous businesses, and we know our people, we know our markets, so it helps us to make a difference in the communities. I also serve as the Vice Chair of the National Indigenous Economic Development Board, and through that work, I get to see what's going on right across the country in terms of business and economic development. For example, I just flew in early this morning from Nanaimo, where I heard presentations from the local communities there, and the Coast Salish Development Corporation, where the community in the past 6 years has developed such businesses as they own a Microtel in partnership now, a hotel. They own real estate, a strip mall. They had one gas station, and then it was a Husky gas station in the kitty corner in the same area. They have an Esso station now, and Tim Hortons. They're doing a lot of 70% of their businesses are off reserve. They had a goal that they set when they did their economic strategy 10 years ago, that they wanted to earn revenues for their community of $10 million a year, and they're almost there, even though they're not finished their 10-year plan yet. So to make $10 million a year for their community, it's just amazing to see what they're doing. But it's like that right across the country. We've been to, of course, I also work with I'm on the board of directors of Peace Hills Trust, where we invest in some of the larger businesses, especially in central Canada. You see in Alberta, the First Nations there are taking the lead on a lot of the services. And again, they're looking at a lot of starting to develop off-reserve businesses. There's, I would say there's quite a few Indigenous hotels across the country. I think when I last counted, there were close to 30 Indigenous hotels with all different hotel chains and independent chains across the country. And I don't think we're really promoting the fact that we have that many hotels that are well run and with great occupancy rates right across the country. We have communities like OCN in northern Manitoba, the Opaskwayak Cree Nation, who, when you go to their community, they have, well, right now they've developed a great partnership in the cannabis industry, but you go to their community, they have a big indoor mall on the reserve with the Tim Hortons next door. They have a big hotel, a restaurant, casino, and all the people from the PA are shopping in that mall. All the people that are sitting in the Tim Hortons are from the PA. So they're attracting that off-reserve business. That's one of the things that our communities do, or our businesses do, is when they develop a business, they're benefiting the whole region. We're not just benefiting our communities. We're hiring people from the surrounding area. We're spending, when we earn extra dollars, we're spending them in the larger area. And so that's helping to make a difference. But right across the country, again, if you go to Ontario, in my area, one of the larger businesses that we've developed over the years is aquaculture. And the freshwater aquaculture is an area that our communities are involved in. Now we have about 36 communities that are in the process of, they're in the business or getting into the business. But one of the things I like about what we're doing there is we're developing our own laws, our own aquaculture laws. So when we're developing Indigenous businesses, we're not only creating jobs, but we're actually starting to exercise our own jurisdiction. I'm so proud of the work that's being done where we authorize and develop our own permitting system for aquaculture. And I think that that's just the start for other areas that we can work in. So when we're looking at businesses, it's not just about developing a business, but it's having larger impacts in terms of exercising our jurisdiction and our rights as Aboriginal people. You know, in Canada, I hear the number now is around 47,000 Indigenous businesses. Many of them are in the area of services, but we touch on every single type of business across the country. We have business leaders that we really need to hold up. And I'm thinking again of some of the work that's being done, and I think of Indigenous women like Victoria Labilois, who owns construction companies and bids for large contracts in the Quebec area. I'm very proud of the work that she is doing. And we have more and more women, Indigenous women involved in businesses. And I think that's what we need to build on to support our younger women, to be examples. I know that some of the women are coming together, the business women are talking about developing an initiative called Because of Her, We Can. And so I think this is something that we want to develop right across the country to raise up these examples of Indigenous women in business. Part of the work, I just want to go right across the country because I get to see this, but when you look at in Cape Breton area, the First Nations got together there to develop one of a huge marine service. They have an industrial building now. They have their own ships that they're developing and storage facilities there for the ocean liners, delivery, and it's just an amazing project, a multi-million-dollar project. All of these are multi-million-dollar projects. And it's really, really difficult to access that capital. But one of the people are doing whatever they can. When you think about, again, yesterday with the Coast Salish people that I heard from, you know, starting out small and building. But not every region across the country, not every business has the opportunity because of the lack of access to capital. And I know that's what this conference is going to be talking about as we go forward. When I think of the opportunity for Indigenous businesses, and I think of through the National Indigenous Economic Development Board, one of the things that we're trying to push really hard is to get a procurement, is opening the doors for procurement within the government, but also with the corporate Canada. We need to focus on those opportunities that are available there to have those contracts at a size and a level that they can break them up so that our businesses can benefit from those opportunities. And so I think the corporate sector is leading in this. We know that we haven't liked the procurement policy or strategy that was in place because it's not really benefiting our businesses, but I hope that some of the tweaks and changes that are being proposed will help to do that. One of the other things that our national board did was we wanted to look at the Indigenous GDP, and we noted that if Indigenous people were employed at the same level as other Canadians across the country, that the Canadian GDP would rise by 27.7 billion. So we would need to create, I've heard different numbers, but around, I think in our report, we talk about 143,000, I believe, jobs that are needed across Canada for Indigenous people. Well, if you look at, that sounds like a large number, but when we break it down by region or province, we're looking at just under 5,000 jobs in Atlantic Canada. When you look at Ontario, we're looking at about 19,000 jobs. And who's the biggest creator of these kinds of jobs is small business. I think if we're going to build those jobs, I really would like to see our recommendations on economic reconciliation to help create those jobs. But I think it's going to be up to Indigenous small business in Canada to create a lot of those jobs. I think we need to set targets for ourselves and what we can do, but the only way to achieve that is the access to capital. Again, I want to say that what AFIs have provided over the past 30 years has been at the same level. We haven't had increases, and so we need to, again, I'm going to save that for future our presenters during this conference. But we can do that. We can help to develop those jobs that are needed to raise our people up to be on a comparable employment level as other Canadians. I just want to end by, summarize another initiative that I've been working on over the past year and a half, and that is with the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development. That's an international organization of which Canada is a member. And they've been around since World War II. They mostly work with the European countries to help develop those economies, but other countries around the world have since joined. And for the first time ever, they're working on an Indigenous specific project. That project is called Linking Indigenous People to Regional Development. It's amazing work that this organization does. They have their researchers are all PhD, they've produced thousands of research papers, and what they do is they advise governments on policy that can help to make change and build economies. The draft report is out and it's not public yet, but I've had a chance to look at that draft report. And I'm really happy with the research that's been done. We've had case studies done in Canada of different, we had 5 case studies in this country, but there were also case studies in Australia, New Zealand, the US, Sweden, wherever there are Indigenous populations. I think we had 12 countries participate in this project. And one of the things that they're showing is that what we need is a better ability to collect data, because when you have data, you can build business cases. Like the data that would be collected, we need to have the data owned by us as Indigenous people. We can't rely on an external source to develop that data and collect it, analyze it for us. We need to be able to have a good source of gathering that data. That could help us in what we're doing as AFIs. That can help us what we're doing as Indigenous communities, having strong data. So that's one of the areas that we've been talking about as part of this report. We're also looking at land tenure. And when I was talking about some of these examples of some of the First Nations, some of them are starting to buy fee simple lands to develop as their commercial areas and using their reserve lands as their residential areas and developing commercial. It's really interesting to see some of the communities taking that approach. But you have to purchase land. You have to have a way to do this development and to get involved in real estate and commercial development. So we need capital for that. And it's not always easy to buy just land that doesn't have commercial buildings on it already. But we know that there's potential. So we need a source of capital for that. The other part of the OECD report talks about economic development. In all of the whole world, we're the only country that has Indigenous-owned banks. Australia doesn't have any yet, or New Zealand. We're the only country that does. But we also, I could tell you that in other countries, the AFI network is the envy of those other countries. They want to have something like this. So I think we have some international consulting we could do on that. And then the fourth area that the study focuses on is governance and how to support building strong Indigenous governments. This report will be published in the fall. I know the part of the report will be presented at the UN Permanent Forum on Indigenous Peoples in New York City in April, May. So there's a lot of work, and I think it's going to benefit our work as we look towards, again, building that business case for access to capital, because we have a lot of opportunity, we have a lot of need, and we need to convince investors, governments of this need and show them of the need, but the opportunities that we're missing by not having direct supports and access to capital to continue to help our businesses, because our businesses are becoming more sophisticated. They're in larger businesses in terms of energy, and some of them are buying into mining partnerships and resource development partnerships. We're not looking at just the small mom and pops anymore. Our communities have grown, and we know that the way to build our economies is through the larger businesses, but we're limited by the resources that are available currently. So I hope that what I've talked about today will spark some interest going forward and some questions. So I want to thank you for your time this morning. Miigwech.
So let's start with dispelling some common myths that at least I continue to read about, often in the comments section of major news media when a story about Indigenous economic development gets reported. Rather than being stagnant, the latest data show that Indigenous entrepreneurship has been growing strong and maturing over the past 20 years. Rather than being locally focused and dependent on government, the latest research shows that Indigenous businesses are open to trade and a diversity of partnerships. And rather than having only a negligible local economic impact, the latest studies over the past 5 or so years show that Indigenous businesses create multi-billion-dollar annual impacts on the Canadian economy. So let's proceed. We'll start with a closer look at this dynamic growth environment. The census is often used as a proxy for Indigenous business growth, based on self-employment data reported by Indigenous entrepreneurs. As depicted in this chart, and as used by many groups like the CCAB, the NIEDB, TD Bank, Conference Board, and federal programs, the historic census profile suggests tremendous growth over the past 20 years. The 2016 census data suggests that around 53,000 Indigenous individuals were self-employed. So let's take a closer look at the age breakdown of these entrepreneurs and what may be driving growth from that end. The census data suggests that we keep an eye on the under 45s for their potential to start new businesses and also to help keep mature businesses going. On average, from 1996 to 2016, 52% of Indigenous entrepreneurs were under 45 and 6% were under 25. For non-Indigenous entrepreneurs, that average profile drops to 45% and 3% respectively. Now, if we shift our focus to the younger, under 35 years of age cohort, which many federal programs use to define youth and young adults, the contrast is just as clear. In 2011, 20% of Indigenous entrepreneurs were under 35 years of age, compared to 15% for non-Indigenous entrepreneurs. In 2016, those proportions were pretty much the same, with young Indigenous entrepreneurs edging slightly higher to 21%. Now, a lot of groups are promoting the value of entrepreneurship for young Indigenous people in Canada, and it makes sense given the broader demographic trends. In 2016, 58% of the 1.6 million Indigenous people in Canada were under 35, and this compares to 42% for non-Indigenous people. Furthermore, since 2011, the Indigenous population aged 25 to 34 grew by 25%, and that added about 47,000 people to the economy. While the Indigenous population aged 15 to 24 grew by 10%, which added more than 27,000 people to that cohort. So there's potential here in these numbers for young Indigenous people to be entering the economy. But economic conditions also need to be considered. For example, when wage growth isn't keeping up with inflation, young people might be tempted to become their own bosses, right? Precarious employment conditions in the labor market can also pressure Indigenous workers to become self-employed during certain periods of time as they search for better income opportunities. So the census and survey data also tell us some more about this context, as they indicate that more young Indigenous adults have a post-secondary education on average than their parents, and that they're also not afraid to switch locations and careers in search of opportunities. With these various dimensions to consider, youth entrepreneurship will then continue to be an important area of research and policy. But before we leave this slide, I want to also raise another equally important pattern reflected in the census data, but which doesn't get told as often as the youth story. And it's about the Indigenous population getting older. In 2001, Indigenous entrepreneurs aged 25 to 44 made up over 50% of self-employed Indigenous people. By comparison, entrepreneurs aged 45 to 64 made up 38%. 10 years later, in 2011, those two cohorts basically switched places, as the 25 to 44 proportion shrunk to 39%, and the 45 to 64 expanded to 50%. In 2016, that 45 to 64 cohort has continued to edge higher, and it's now at 52%. So with the aging population, there's increasing pressure to think about retirement, wealth planning, and business succession, especially in fields such as agriculture and construction, which are home to the greatest concentrations of mature Indigenous business owners. So who will inherit the wealth and knowledge mature entrepreneurs have created? To what extent are mature business owners actively passing on what they've learned and accumulated to the younger generations by providing mentorship, private equity, and so forth? In this demographic context then, mature Indigenous entrepreneurs have an important role to play to help invest in and guide younger generations. Turning now to an industry profile of Indigenous entrepreneurs in 2016, we see some similarities to their non-Indigenous counterparts, but also important distinctions. Notably, Indigenous entrepreneurs are not more concentrated in public services, as some myth makers may suggest. They're actually less concentrated. Indigenous entrepreneurs are, however, more concentrated in fields such as construction and natural resource sectors compared to non-Indigenous entrepreneurs. They're also relatively underrepresented in business services such as finance, management, insurance, and accounting. The general profile does, however, suggest an openness to trade and partnership opportunities. Based on what we know about industries and trade, and the Conference Board of Canada does a lot of research in this vein, over 50% of Indigenous entrepreneurs in Canada are located in industries with export potential. Now, in terms of who's seizing that potential, recent business surveys and research indicate that somewhere between 10 and 25% of Indigenous entrepreneurs self-identify as exporters, depending on their location and industry. So location is an important distinguishing factor that arises in the census data. Here we see the profiles of Indigenous and non-Indigenous entrepreneurs diverging between large urban versus rural, small, medium, and urban concentrations. In terms of associated business investment prospects, rural remote opportunities emphasize natural resource sectors, but also significant are opportunities to partner on local community services, such as public works, major projects, supply chains, infrastructure, and various types of infrastructure development, including housing, transportation systems, and green technology.